Sometimes, the smallest knock arrives at the exact moment a heart has forgotten how to listen. Nathan Carter had spent 20 years believing that every answer worth hearing came through a boardroom speaker or a signed contract. He trusted numbers, schedules, and carefully planned decisions. He trusted tinted windows that kept the noise of the city outside where it belonged. But on one chilly Tuesday afternoon in downtown Seattle, while gray clouds hung low over the skyline and a soft drizzle painted silver streaks across the windshield of his black luxury sedan, something happened that no calendar could have predicted. Traffic slowed to a stop at a red light on Fifth Avenue. Nathan barely noticed. His attention lingered on the glowing screen in his hand, where another message from his executive assistant reminded him about an investor meeting in exactly 23 minutes. Another meeting. Another presentation. Another room filled with people who admired his success but knew almost nothing about the man himself. The heater hummed quietly inside the car, wrapping him in comfortable warmth while raindrops rolled lazily down the glass. Outside, umbrellas drifted across crosswalks like dark flowers carried by the wind. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A street musician folded his guitar into its worn case before the rain grew heavier. Life moved in every direction except Nathan's. It had been that way for years. Since losing the only person who had ever convinced him that success meant more than stock prices and headlines, he had mastered the art of moving forward without ever truly feeling alive. Then came the sound. Tap. 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 It was so gentle that he almost mistook it for rain striking the side window. He frowned but kept looking at his phone. Tap. 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 This time it was unmistakable. Someone was knocking on the passenger side window. Nathan sighed under his breath. He had learned long ago not to encourage strangers approaching expensive cars at stoplights. Most wanted money. Some wanted directions. Others simply hoped generosity traveled with expensive suits. Without lifting his eyes completely, he prepared to gesture politely that he couldn't help. But something stopped him. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe it was the strange patience behind those tiny knocks. He slowly turned his head. Standing beside the window was a little girl, no older than 7. Rain clung to loose strands of her light blonde hair beneath a faded knit cap. Her navy coat looked a size too large, its sleeves rolled back over small hands that held a cream-colored envelope against her chest. She wasn't waving. She wasn't begging. She wasn't smiling. She simply waited with a quiet calm that seemed impossible for someone her age. Their eyes met through the rain-speckled glass. Hers were clear blue, steady, almost impossibly gentle. She lifted one finger and pointed toward the envelope instead of holding out her hand for money. Nathan hesitated. Behind him, a horn sounded impatiently, but the traffic ahead remained frozen. Slowly, almost without understanding why, he pressed the button and lowered the window just a few inches. Cool damp air slipped inside the warm cabin. The little girl stepped closer, careful not to touch the polished paint. She extended the envelope with both hands as though it contained something precious. Her voice was soft, almost carried away by the rain. "If you're really Mr. Nathan Carter, would you please read this before you drive away?" Nathan accepted the envelope without thinking. It felt surprisingly light. There was no name written across the front. No address. Only a tiny pressed daisy tucked beneath the folded flap. He looked back up, ready to ask who she was, but before a single word left his mouth, the traffic light turned green, engines began rolling forward, and the little girl quietly stepped back onto the sidewalk, disappearing into the moving crowd before Nathan could even open the door. Nathan did not drive away immediately. The impatient honks behind him faded into the distance as another driver pulled around his car, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the small cream-colored envelope resting in his hand. It looked ordinary, the kind someone might buy in a neighborhood stationery store for a few dollars. Yet the tiny pressed daisy tucked beneath its flap felt strangely deliberate. protected with the care of someone who believed even the smallest beautiful things deserved to survive. He reached the next corner, signaled into an empty curbside parking space, and turned off the engine. The silence inside the sedan settled over him almost instantly. Rain tapped softly against the roof while the city continued its endless rhythm beyond the windshield. Nathan loosened his tie and stared at the envelope for several long seconds. He could not explain why his pulse had begun to quicken. It was only a letter. Yet something about the little girl's steady eyes had refused to leave his thoughts. She had not looked frightened. She had not looked desperate. She had looked certain, as though she had spent days waiting for this exact moment. Finally, he slipped one finger beneath the flap and unfolded the neatly creased sheet inside. The handwriting belonged to a child, careful and patient, every letter shaped with remarkable attention. Dear Mr. Nathan Carter, if this letter found you, then thank you for stopping. Mommy always said that kind people are busy too, but they still make time to listen. She told me not to be afraid of asking the right person when my heart knew who that person was. Nathan blinked. His gaze moved more slowly across the page. Mommy told me about you when she was sick. She said you used to visit someone in the hospital every Thursday evening. She said you always smiled at the nurses even when you looked sad. She said good people sometimes forget that they are good because life becomes too heavy. If you are still that man, then maybe you can help me keep a promise. His breath caught almost imperceptibly. The hospital. Thursdays. Those words unlocked memories that had been. Nathan looked at the photograph one more time before placing it carefully back inside the envelope, as though it belonged to something far more valuable than paper. His investor meeting had already begun without him. His assistant had called twice. 3 unread messages now waited on his phone, each marked urgent, each representing a world that suddenly felt strangely distant. For the first time in years, he silenced the device completely. He stepped out into the cool Seattle rain with the envelope tucked safely inside his coat and scanned the sidewalks in every direction. Commuters hurried toward buses. Cyclists splashed through shallow puddles. Parents guided children beneath colorful umbrellas. But the little blonde girl had disappeared as quietly as she had arrived. Nathan crossed the intersection anyway, stopping anyone who looked as though they might have noticed her. A florist arranging buckets of fresh tulips outside her shop shook her head with a polite smile. A newspaper vendor remembered seeing a little girl carrying an envelope but could not say where she had gone. Even the barista inside the corner coffee shop thought she had seen someone matching the description walking toward the waterfront nearly 20 minutes earlier. Nathan thanked each person before continuing farther than he had planned. His polished shoes collected drops of rain that he would normally have avoided without a second thought. The city around him seemed different now, filled with stories he had never taken the time to notice. An elderly couple laughed beneath a shared umbrella. A construction worker handed his spare rain jacket to a coworker who had forgotten one. A teenager stopped to help a tourist read a confusing street map. Small acts of kindness unfolded everywhere, quiet enough to disappear unless someone chose to look. Nathan realized he had spent years seeing buildings instead of people. Nearly 40 minutes later, he reached a narrow public overlook facing Elliott Bay. The clouds had lowered until sea and sky blended into one endless sheet of gray. Wooden benches lined the path overlooking the water. A bronze plaque described the sunsets that drew visitors throughout every season. Nathan's heart skipped as he remembered the letter. Mommy used to watch the sunsets. He searched the overlook slowly until his eyes landed on a tiny figure sitting alone at the far end of the last bench. Ellie held a small notebook against her knees while carefully folding another piece of paper. She noticed him almost immediately but did not run. Instead, she offered the same calm expression she had worn at the traffic light, as though she had quietly trusted he would come. Nathan approached at an unhurried pace, leaving several feet between them so she would not feel uncomfortable. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The only sounds were distant ferry horns and gentle rain brushing against the bay. Finally Nathan held up the cream-colored envelope. I read every word, he said softly. Ellie's shoulders relaxed with visible relief. Thank you, she answered. Most people throw letters away before they even open them. Nathan looked at the notebook resting in her lap. Your mother really worked at Harborview Medical Center, did she not? Ellie nodded with quiet pride. She said hospitals are places where people remember what matters most. Nathan swallowed slowly. I remember her. Ellie's blue eyes brightened just enough to catch the gray afternoon light. She reached into the notebook and carefully removed another folded letter, holding it gently with both hands. This is the promise I wrote about, she whispered. I cannot read it out loud by myself yet. Every time I try, I stop before the end. Mommy always believed strangers become neighbors the moment they choose to care. I was hoping, maybe you could help me keep her last promise. Ellie held the folded letter with extraordinary care, smoothing one corner that had curled from being opened too many times. Nathan accepted it gently, almost instinctively matching the respect she showed it. The paper was soft from use, carrying the faint scent of lavender that had somehow survived the passion. The afternoon drifted quietly toward evening as the warmth of the cafe softened the chill that had followed them inside. Outside, Seattle remained wrapped in gentle rain, but within the small corner booth time seemed to slow. Ellie stirred the whipped cream into her hot chocolate with careful circles, watching tiny white clouds disappear beneath the surface. Nathan found himself doing something he had not done with another person in a very long time. He simply listened. There was no presentation to interrupt, no deadline waiting for an answer, no phone vibrating across the table demanding his attention. Tell me about your grandmother, he asked softly. Ellie's face brightened. Grandma Rose says every morning should begin by opening the curtains, even when it is raining. She says light always tries its best. Nathan smiled. She sounds wise. Ellie nodded proudly. She was a librarian for 38 years. She still reads to me every night, even when she gets tired. Nathan noticed the gentle pause before those last words. Does she not feel well? Ellie looked down into her mug before answering honestly. She gets tired more often now. Some days she cannot walk very far. She says it is just part of getting older. Nathan understood there was more behind the simple explanation, but he chose not to press. Instead, he asked, do you both live nearby? Ellie pointed toward the hills beyond the waterfront. About 15 minutes away. We have a little apartment above Mr. Jenkins's hardware store. She reached into her backpack and carefully removed a worn blue notebook decorated with tiny pressed flowers between its pages. Mommy told me to write down happy things, so I do not forget them. Nathan looked at the notebook with quiet curiosity. Ellie opened it slowly. Every page held small drawings, neat handwriting, and tiny memories. One page showed a sunset above Elliott Bay. Another showed 2 steaming mugs labeled Grandma and Me. There was a sketch of a library window covered with snow and another of a nurse wearing blue scrubs with bright smiling eyes. Tucked inside the back cover was another pressed daisy almost identical to the one from the envelope. Mommy liked flowers that came back every year, Ellie explained. She said hope should be easy to recognize. Nathan turned another page and unexpectedly saw a familiar face sketched in colored pencil. It was himself, standing beside a hospital bed years earlier with a paper coffee cup in one hand. The drawing was simple, but unmistakable. Beneath it Ellie had copied something her mother once told her. Sometimes people save each other without ever knowing it. Nathan stared quietly at the page. His wife had spent months in that hospital. During those difficult evenings he had often believed he was the one receiving kindness from strangers who asked for nothing in return. He had never imagined that someone had remembered him too. Your mother drew this, he asked. Ellie shook her head. I did after she described you. She said you always thanked everyone before you left the room. She wanted me to remember that kindness has a face. Nathan felt his throat tighten gently. Outside, the rain had begun to fade, allowing pale evening light to slip through the cafe windows. Ellie carefully closed the notebook and returned it to her backpack. Grandma says Mommy believed people meet for a reason, she whispered. I think today was one of those reasons. Nathan looked across the table at the little girl who had quietly walked into his carefully protected world carrying nothing more than letters, memories, and unwavering hope. For the first time since leaving the hospital years ago, he found himself wondering not what tomorrow's schedule demanded, but what tomorrow might allow him to become. When they stepped outside, the rain had almost disappeared, leaving the streets washed clean beneath a pale evening sky. The city lights shimmered across the wet pavement like scattered stars, and a cool breeze drifted in from Elliott Bay carrying the scent of salt and cedar. Nathan walked beside Ellie instead of several steps ahead, matching the shorter rhythm of her stride without thinking about it. She seemed perfectly content with the quiet, occasionally looking up to point out things most adults hurried past. A family of ducks glided across a small fountain. A violinist played beneath the awning of an old bookstore. A golden retriever waited patiently outside a bakery while its owner carried out a warm loaf of bread. Mommy said people are happiest when they notice little things, Ellie said. She called them everyday miracles. Nathan looked around as if seeing the city for the first time. I think I stopped noticing them a long time ago. Ellie tilted her head. Maybe they were waiting for you. Her answer settled gently in his heart. They reached his parked sedan just as the first rays of sunset broke through the thinning clouds, painting streaks of gold across the skyline. Nathan opened the passenger door. May I drive you and your grandmother home? Ellie hesitated politely before asking the question that surprised him most. Would it be too much trouble? Nathan smiled, a genuine smile that had become unfamiliar on his own face. I think it would be the best part of my day. During the short drive, Ellie quietly described the neighborhood where she lived. She pointed out the elementary school where her mother had once volunteered to read books to younger children. She showed him the community garden where Grandma Rose still grew small pots of herbs every spring. She laughed softly while describing a stray orange cat that believed every apartment building belonged to him. Nathan found himself asking questions simply because he wanted to hear her answers. The conversation flowed without effort, filling the spacious car with something it had not carried in years. Warmth. They eventually stopped beside a modest brick building with flower boxes beneath the windows. The sign for Jenkins Hardware hung below the second-floor apartments exactly as Ellie had described. She gathered her backpack but paused before opening the door. Would you like to meet Grandma? She asked. Nathan looked toward the aging staircase leading upstairs. Every appointment on tomorrow's calendar suddenly felt less important than the invitation before him. I would be honored. The apartment was small but welcoming, filled with bookshelves that reached nearly every wall. Framed family photographs rested beside potted plants on sunny windowsills. A quilt draped neatly across a well-loved sofa, and the comforting aroma of vegetable soup lingered in the air. Nothing inside suggested wealth, yet everything reflected care. An elderly woman with gentle silver hair slowly rose from her reading chair as Ellie entered. Grandma, this is Mr. Nathan Carter. Rose smiled kindly before he could introduce himself. I know exactly who you are. Nathan blinked in surprise. Rose motioned toward a framed photograph resting beside an old lamp. It showed a younger woman in blue hospital scrubs smiling beside her daughter. Emily talked about you often after those long evenings at the hospital, Rose said softly. She told me there was one husband who always remembered every nurse's name and thanked every person who walked through the room, even while carrying his own heartbreak. Nathan stood silently, humbled by words he had never expected to hear. Rose looked at him with eyes that reflected years of wisdom rather than sorrow. My daughter believed kindness echoes farther than success ever will, she said. Today, I think one of those echoes finally found its way back home. Over the following weeks, Nathan found himself taking a route through the city that had never appeared on any navigation app. Every Wednesday after work he stopped by the apartment above Jenkins' Hardware, not because anyone expected him to, but because somewhere along the way it had begun to feel like the place where the noise inside his mind finally became quiet. Ellie would already be sitting by the front window with her blue notebook balanced on her knees, pretending to read while secretly watching for his car. The moment she recognized it, she would smile with the kind of joy that asked for nothing in return. Rose always welcomed him with fresh tea and stories that somehow turned ordinary days into treasured memories. Some evenings they played simple card games around the small kitchen table. Other nights Rose recommended old novels from the shelves that lined the apartment walls, insisting every good story deserved to be shared with someone. Nathan discovered he laughed more during those evenings than he had in the previous 5 years combined. His office noticed the change before he did. Employees who once hesitated to approach the reserved chief executive suddenly found him asking about their families, remembering birthdays, and lingering after meetings to hear ideas that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. His assistant quietly remarked that he had started looking out the windows instead of only at spreadsheets. Nathan simply smiled without explaining why. Yet life rarely changes without testing whether the new path is genuine. One Friday afternoon, as Nathan prepared to leave the office early for Rose's apartment, his phone rang. The caller identified himself as Daniel Pierce, an attorney representing a distant relative of Ellie's late mother. Nathan listened carefully while Daniel explained that a family member named Victor Lawson had recently contacted him after learning about Emily's passing. Victor wished to pursue legal guardianship of Ellie, claiming he wanted to reconnect with the remaining family. The words sounded reasonable on the surface, but something in the attorney's measured tone suggested uncertainty. Nathan thanked him and immediately drove to see Rose. She was seated in her favorite reading chair when he arrived, though the smile she offered carried a trace of worry he had never seen before. Ellie sensed the mood almost immediately and quietly excused herself to organize books in her bedroom, giving the adults privacy without being asked. Rose folded her hands in her lap and sighed gently. "I was hoping this day would not come so soon," she admitted. She explained that Victor was Emily's distant cousin. Years had passed without visits, letters, or holiday calls. After Emily became ill, he never reached out. After the funeral, he remained absent. Only now, months later, had he suddenly expressed interest in becoming part of Ellie's life. "Do you believe he truly wants a relationship with her?" Nathan asked carefully. Rose looked toward the closed bedroom door before answering. "I believe Ellie deserves people who arrive because they love her, not because life suddenly makes it convenient." Nathan nodded quietly. Through the slightly open doorway he could hear Ellie humming softly while arranging books exactly the way her grandmother had taught her. The sound was peaceful, innocent, completely unaware of the uncertainty gathering just beyond the room. Nathan looked around the little apartment once more. The books. The quilt. The framed photograph of Emily in blue scrubs. The pressed daisies tucked inside Ellie's notebook. Every promise that had quietly brought him here suddenly felt too important to leave to chance. Without making a grand declaration, he reached across the table and gently rested his hand over Rose's. "Whatever happens next," he said with calm conviction, "you and Ellie will not face it alone. I made that decision the moment I opened her first letter. I simply did not realize it until now." The days that followed unfolded with a quiet steadiness that reminded Nathan of turning pages in one of Rose's favorite novels. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. Instead, trust continued growing through ordinary moments. Nathan attended Ellie's school reading celebration after rearranging an important business luncheon without hesitation. He drove Rose to her regular medical appointments, waiting beside her with the same patience she had once described in Emily's stories. On Saturday mornings, the three of them visited the community garden where Rose carefully clipped fresh rosemary while Ellie searched for the first flowers brave enough to bloom after the rain. One afternoon, Daniel Pierce called again with an update. After reviewing family records, speaking with neighbors, and meeting everyone involved, he had also begun asking difficult questions. Victor Lawson had never visited Ellie before contacting the attorney. He had no history of caring for her, no relationship with Rose, and no meaningful presence in the child's life. When invited to spend time getting to know Ellie before making further decisions, he gradually stopped returning phone calls altogether. Weeks later, he formally withdrew his request, explaining that he no longer wished to pursue guardianship. The uncertainty that had quietly lingered over the apartment finally lifted like morning fog beneath warm sunlight. Rose closed her eyes with visible relief after hearing the news, whispering a grateful thank you that filled the little living room with peaceful silence. Nathan looked toward Ellie, who was sitting cross-legged on the rug, completely absorbed in sketching another sunset inside her blue notebook. She looked up only when she noticed everyone smiling. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Rose nodded warmly. "Everything is exactly as it should be." As autumn slowly gave way to winter, another conversation began taking shape without anyone forcing it. One evening, after homemade vegetable soup and slices of fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery, Rose carried a small cedar box from the bedroom and placed it gently on the coffee table. "Emily asked me to keep these until the right time," she said softly. Inside were carefully folded letters tied with pale blue ribbon, a silver locket, several pressed daisies preserved between wax paper, and one final envelope with Nathan's name written across the front in Emily's elegant handwriting. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter was brief but unforgettable. Emily thanked him for showing compassion during the hardest chapter of her life, not only toward her family but toward every nurse, volunteer, and patient he encountered in those hospital hallways. She wrote that kindness often travels farther than the person offering it could ever imagine. She hoped that if life ever crossed his path with Ellie's, he would simply remind her daughter that hope always deserved another chance. Nathan lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak for several moments. Rose smiled through gentle tears. "I think Emily trusted the future more than the rest of us did." Nathan looked at Ellie, who had quietly walked over holding her notebook. She carefully slipped one of the preserved daisies between its familiar pages before looking back at him. "Mommy said flowers come back every year," she whispered. "Maybe people can too, just in different ways." Nathan nodded, his voice almost disappearing beneath emotion. "I believe she was right." That evening, before leaving, he carefully framed the first cream-colored envelope and the tiny pressed daisy that had started everything, promising Rose that one day it would hang somewhere everyone in the family could see it. For the first time in many years, the word family no longer sounded like a memory. It sounded like tomorrow. Nearly a year later, the city welcomed another gentle spring, and Seattle seemed brighter in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Cherry blossoms lined familiar streets, the community garden overflowed with fresh green leaves, and the apartment above Jenkins' Hardware was filled with laughter more often than silence. Rose remained the heart of the little home, still greeting every morning by opening the curtains exactly as she always had, allowing sunlight to pour across shelves crowded with beloved books. Nathan had become such a natural part of their lives that neighbors no longer introduced him as the successful businessman from downtown. To them, he was simply the man who never forgot library book sales, who carried groceries upstairs without being asked, and who somehow remembered everyone's name. At Carter Dynamics, employees noticed another transformation. A scholarship honoring Emily's dedication to compassionate nursing now helped students beginning careers in healthcare. Volunteer Days replaced one of the company's quarterly corporate events. The executive dining room served meals every Friday to local nonprofit organizations. Whenever reporters asked Nathan what had inspired the changes, he always smiled before giving the same answer. "Someone reminded me that success only matters if it leaves room for kindness." He never mentioned that the reminder had arrived carrying a cream-colored envelope and a pressed daisy. One Saturday evening, as the sky slowly turned shades of gold and lavender, Nathan drove Ellie to the overlook above Elliott Bay where they had first shared her mother's final letter. The familiar wooden benches overlooked calm water reflecting the fading sunlight exactly as Emily had once loved. Ellie climbed out of the car carrying her blue notebook, now thicker with another year's worth of memories, drawings, and carefully preserved flowers. Nathan walked beside her until they reached the last bench overlooking the horizon. They sat together without speaking for several peaceful moments, watching ferries glide quietly across the bay. Ellie opened her notebook and gently placed one fresh daisy beside the pressed flower that had traveled with her since the day they met. "I think Mommy would like this sunset," she whispered. Nathan looked toward the glowing horizon and nodded. "I think she already does." Ellie smiled before reaching into her backpack and removing a small wooden frame wrapped in soft cloth. She handed it to Nathan with both hands. Inside, perfectly preserved beneath glass, rested the very first cream-colored envelope, the tiny pressed daisy, and the photograph of Emily smiling beside her daughter. Below them Ellie had written a single sentence in careful handwriting. "Thank you for stopping." Nathan looked at the frame for a long time before quietly setting it beside them on the bench. His eyes glistened, but his smile never faded. Ellie stood, walked a few steps toward the parked sedan, and gently tapped twice on the passenger side window exactly the way she had on that rainy afternoon so many months before. Tap. Tap. Nathan laughed softly as he lowered the window. Ellie leaned down with the same calm blue eyes that had changed everything. "Good thing you opened the window," she said. Nathan shook his head with quiet gratitude. "No," he answered gently. "The good thing was that you decided to knock." Together they watched the last light disappear beyond the water, surrounded not by extraordinary miracles but by the quiet power of ordinary kindness. Sometimes the greatest fortunes are not measured in dollars, buildings, or headlines. Sometimes they begin with a child brave enough to knock, a stranger willing to listen, and a single moment that reminds two lonely hearts they were never meant to walk through life alone.